My father did not yell. He set his bourbon down, looked at me like a broken chair, and calmly stated the family would be better off without me. I did not argue. I drove away from the holiday lights, and by morning quietly scrubbed my name from every corporate guarantee he relied on. When the panicked calls started that evening, it was not his voice that made me freeze. It was his lawyer. My name is Addie Rivera. I am 36 years old, and for the better part of my adult life, I have treated my relationship with my family like a complex compliance project to be managed and mitigated. On the evening of the 24th of December, I drove down the familiar winding roads to the sprawling stone-fronted house in the affluent suburbs of Matthews, North Carolina. I returned fully expecting the usual holiday routine, carrying the quiet hope that we could just get through one dinner without an agenda. I walked through the heavy oak doors, and the air inside immediately hit me with the scent of roasted pecans, expensive pine candles, and the subtle, unmistakable tension of high-stakes maneuvering. I dropped my wool coat over a chair in the hallway and went straight to the massive kitchen. I began aligning the silverware, adjusting the folded linen napkins, and wiping away imaginary smudges on the flawless granite countertops. It was a deeply ingrained habit born of absolute necessity. If I kept my hands busy and the environment meticulously spotless, I did not have to acknowledge the heavy truth that this place had not felt like a true home to me since I was a teenager. It was merely a staging ground for my father's life. My father, Daniel Rivera, held court in the adjacent living room with a glass in his hand. He is the founder and principal operator of Rivera Custom Interiors, a man who built his entire existence on the gospel of his own unshakable charm. All through the autumn months, he had been boasting endlessly about his latest conquest. It was an aging historic mountain property called Foxmere House, nestled deeply in the woods just outside of Highlands. To hear him tell it to his golf partners and business associates, he was not just buying a piece of real estate, he was acquiring a legacy. He planned to gut the rustic inn and transform it into a premier luxury wedding resort, the kind of exclusive destination that charged tens of thousands of dollars for a single weekend. It was supposed to be the absolute crown jewel of his career, the massive pivot that would elevate the Rivera name from successful local contractors to untouchable regional developers. But I knew the truth because I always knew the truth. My father's ambition consistently and dangerously outpaced his actual capital. Foxmere House looked magnificent in the glossy, professionally bound mock-ups he showed around the country club, but beneath the polished surface, the deal was a terrifying labyrinth of financial sinkholes and legal blind spots. He was leveraging assets he barely owned to secure bridge loans he could not afford, glossing over environmental contingencies and zoning restrictions with his trademark booming laugh and firm, confident handshakes. He expected the world to simply bend to his will, because it always had. The evening progressed exactly as I had feared it would, building up to a quiet breaking point. The turning point arrived just before the main course was served. We were gathered around the massive oak dining table, the heavy crystal glasses gleaming under the glow of the chandelier. Daniel poured himself a generous measure of top-shelf bourbon. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his fist on the table or turn red in the face. My father's cruelty has always been impeccably dressed, perfectly calibrated, and politely delivered. He casually pushed a single sheet of paper across the polished wood toward my plate. It was a vague, poorly drafted letter of confirmation. The document essentially stated that I, in my professional corporate capacity, had reviewed the risk profiles and compliance structures of the Foxmere acquisition and found them sound and secure. He needed my signature to placate a nervous seller and a deeply skeptical mezzanine lender. He needed those men in suits to believe that his daughter, the strict corporate director, was implicitly backing his play and guaranteeing his competence. I looked at the paper lying next to my fork, and then I looked up at him. I told him quietly and firmly that I could not sign it. I explained, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, that it was a material misrepresentation of the facts. I reminded him that I had explicitly told him weeks ago I would not attach my professional standing or my hard-earned reputation to a project riddled with such glaring, undocumented liabilities. Daniel did not erupt. He just sighed. It was a long, incredibly weary sound of a man burdened by an ungrateful, difficult child. He set his bourbon down on the table with a soft click. He looked at me, his dark gaze entirely devoid of paternal warmth, staring through me as if I were a defective piece of machinery on one of his construction sites. He stated calmly that if I was unwilling to support the family like a grown adult, if I was going to sit at his table and stubbornly refuse to help build our collective future, then it would be best if I did not come back. He said he was exhausted by my constant negativity and my endless demands for proper procedure. He looked me dead in the eye and stated, with chilling, absolute certainty, that he and the entire family would be better off without me. The words hung in the warm air, heavy, final, and absolute. I looked around the beautifully decorated table. My stepmother, Celeste Rivera, did not gasp in shock. She did not intervene or attempt to soften his harsh words. She merely lowered her eyes and took a sudden, intense interest in the fabric of her napkin, her deliberate silence acting as a complete and total endorsement of his decree. Across from me, my younger brother, Noah Rivera, offered a faint, self-satisfied smirk. Noah spent company money like water and treated consequence like a foreign language he refused to learn. To him, I was not a sister. I was simply the rigid killjoy who always ruined the holiday mood with my relentless caution and my annoying demand for basic accountability. In that crystalline moment, the stark reality of the situation washed over me, cold and clarifying. Daniel had not spoken out of sudden frustration. The letter was prepared. The audience was seated and rehearsed. The ultimatum was a calculated, deliberate strategy. He had engineered this exact confrontation to force my hand. He truly believed I would be so terrified of being formally cast out of the family circle on Christmas Eve that I would pick up the silver pen and sign my name, abandoning my professional principles for the sake of his hollow approval. He gave me a very simple choice: submit to his reality or vanish from his world entirely. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice to match his silent, crushing aggression. I did not plead my case or attempt to explain the devastating legal consequences of what he was demanding I do. Arguing with Daniel Rivera was like pouring clean water into a bottomless void. It only drained you completely while leaving him entirely unchanged and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. I simply stood up. The scraping of my wooden chair against the hardwood floor sounded incredibly loud in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the dining room. I walked out of the room and went straight up the carpeted stairs to my old childhood bedroom. I did not look back. I grabbed my leather overnight bag, threw in the few toiletries and sweaters I had brought for the long weekend, and zipped it shut with a sharp, decisive pull. When I walked back downstairs, the expensive holiday playlist was still softly crooning a cheerful rendition of classic winter songs through the hidden ceiling speakers. It felt deeply surreal, like watching a dramatic movie scene entirely missing its emotional musical score. I walked right past the dining room archway. No one called out my name. No one told me to stop. No footsteps followed me down the hall to the front door. I stepped out into the biting December cold, my breath immediately misting in the freezing air. The massive exterior of the house was draped in thousands of perfectly synchronized white lights, glowing with a bright, artificial warmth that completely betrayed the icy, transactional nature of the people sitting inside. I threw my heavy bag into the passenger seat of my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the long, winding driveway without glancing in the rearview mirror. The drive back to my rented apartment in Charlotte took just under an hour, but it felt like crossing a vast, dark ocean. The interstate highway was mostly empty, a long black ribbon cutting through the silent holiday night. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning white under the streetlights, but my mind was remarkably, beautifully clear. The pain blooming in my chest was sharp, deep, and undeniable, but it was also incredibly clean. For years, I had twisted myself into impossible knots trying to be the dutiful daughter, I had spent countless hours trying to bring order to my father's chaotic, sprawling ambitions, foolishly hoping that if I just proved my competence and loyalty, I would eventually earn his genuine respect and unconditional love. But the truth was riding right there in the car with me. My family had never actually wanted the person I was. They did not care about my personal boundaries, my career trajectory, or my peace of mind. They only wanted my usefulness. They wanted the impenetrable shield my corporate reputation provided, the invisible financial safety net I represented, and the blind, unquestioning loyalty I was supposed to offer on demand. The very second I refused to be a convenient tool for their enrichment, I ceased to be family. I was just an uncooperative asset to be discarded. The realization hurt, but as the city lights of Charlotte finally appeared on the horizon, I knew I was truly free. I spend my professional life dissecting the anatomy of future disasters. At Ashbourne Risk Collective, a premier high-rise firm in Uptown Charlotte, my official title is Senior Construction Compliance Director. To the layperson, that might sound like someone who merely checks boxes on a clipboard in a dusty trailer. In reality, I am the person who looks at a $50 million commercial development and tells the mezzanine lender exactly which subcontractor is going to bankrupt the entire project in 6 weeks or 6 months. I deal exclusively in the unglamorous, concrete truths of the building world. My daily routine involves tracking contractor risk profiles, tracing liquidity trails through multiple corporate shells, verifying the exact wording of builder liability insurance policies, and hunting down hidden flaws in unconditional lien waivers. My specific specialty, the primary reason I command the salary I do, is finding the rot in files that look absolutely perfect to the untrained eye. When a regional developer hands me a spreadsheet that balances flawlessly on the very first try, or a massive draw request where every single subcontractor release is signed and notarized on the exact same afternoon, my internal alarms go off. Corporate fraud and financial failure rarely announce themselves with messy, chaotic paperwork. They hide behind documents that are just a little too clean. My job is to see the empty space where the money should be, the missing email threads, the forced optimism in the financial projections. I am paid to be naturally suspicious and professionally relentless. For my entire adult life, my father mocked this career path. He frequently called it pushing paper to find problems where none existed. Daniel is a man of action, a charismatic builder who loves the smell of fresh sawdust and the roar of a diesel engine on a busy site. To him, people in my line of work are just bloated overhead. The necessary evils of the modern corporate world who only serve to slow down real progress with endless red tape. Yet, the deep hypocrisy of our relationship was that whenever Rivera Custom Interiors hit a solid legal wall, I was always his very first phone call. If a massive lumber supplier threatened a sudden stop work order over a disputed invoice from 3 months ago, or a stubborn insurance adjuster tried to deny a complex liability claim regarding water damage, Daniel would instantly forget his loud disdain for my profession. He would forward me the messy, convoluted email chains late at night and ask me to translate the dense legalese into a quick exit strategy. He used my brain the way he used his favorite heavy-duty power tools, picking me up when he needed to break through a barrier and putting me right back in the dark toolbox the second the job was done. The Foxmere House transaction was entirely different from his usual contracts. It was supposed to be his undisputed masterpiece. It was not merely a real estate acquisition. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical performance designed exclusively for the local business elite. For decades, he had been the guy wealthy people hired to remodel their extravagant kitchens or build their custom pool houses. Now, he desperately wanted to be the visionary developer sitting on the other side of the mahogany desk. Buying a sprawling historic mountain property and converting it into an ultra-luxury wedding venue was his calculated, desperate bid to leapfrog into a much higher socioeconomic bracket. He wanted the country club board members to finally see him as a financial peer, not just a highly paid vendor. Because the financial stakes were so incredibly high, he had asked me to look over the initial offering memorandums early in the fall. I agreed, strictly as a reluctant favor, to review a few specific operational files. I immediately pointed out the glaring, dangerous risks. The zoning permits for the surrounding land were ancient and likely invalid for heavy commercial hospitality use. The structural engineering reports conveniently ignored the obvious settling foundation on the west wing of the main lodge. I told him these things clearly and without sugarcoating the reality. I also drew a harsh, immovable line in the sand regarding my own participation. I stated verbally and documented in writing that I was not officially involved in the venture. I would not invest a single dollar of my personal money. I would not act as a guarantor for any loan. I would not sit on the board of the newly formed holding company, and I would absolutely not vouch for the financial stability of the project to any third party under any circumstances. I thought I had protected myself, but in the tightly knit, highly gossip-driven world of commercial real estate finance in the Carolinas, my name carries a specific, undeniable weight. Ashbourne Risk Collective is known across the state for being utterly merciless in our due diligence. If a project manages to pass our desk, institutional lenders sleep very well at night. Daniel understood this collateral value better than anyone else in the industry. He realized very quickly that he did not actually need my physical money to make the deal work. He just needed the heavy implication of my professional presence. Whenever his negotiations with the seller hit a frustrating snag, he would casually mention to the room that his daughter, the strict compliance director down in Charlotte, was keeping a close eye on the paperwork to make sure everything was standard. Almost instantly, the aggressive tone of the skeptical commercial brokers would soften. The seller's cautious attorneys would relax their rigid demands for deeper escrow reserves. The title insurance officers would approve marginal, poorly drafted documents they would normally kick back for revision. They all made a massive, fatal assumption. They assumed that if Addie Rivera was anywhere near the deal, the baseline compliance was rock solid. They truly believed I would never let my own father walk blindly into a financial trap. So they completely lowered their own professional defenses. Daniel successfully weaponized my hard-earned reputation to build a flimsy bridge over his massive financial gaps. Over the past few weeks, leading up to the holiday disaster, a cold, creeping suspicion had taken firm root in my mind. The casual requests for me to just quickly glance at a minor document had grown much more frequent. The questions from his longtime attorney had become strangely specific, touching on reserve structures I had never been given access to. I realized with a sickening clarity that he was not just borrowing my expertise for friendly advice. He was actively using my image, projecting me to his equity partners and mezzanine lenders as a silent, stabilizing partner in the family enterprise. He was spending my credibility, a currency I had spent over a decade building, to buy himself a few more weeks of borrowed time. That was the profound, clarifying truth that hit me as I drove back to the city after being coldly told to leave my childhood home. He had forced me out of the family circle because I stubbornly refused to blindly sign my name to a lie. But I knew with absolute certainty he was still leaning heavily on the phantom presence of my approval to keep his fragile dream alive. He wanted the immense benefit of my reputation without the annoying burden of my actual oversight. Therefore, sitting alone in the quiet dark of my apartment in the early hours of Christmas morning, I decided to execute the coldest and most necessary professional maneuver of my entire life. If I was no longer a recognized part of the family, then the family no longer had any right to access my professional shield. My father wanted to operate without my interference, and I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, but entirely on my terms. I was going to surgically, legally, and permanently sever my name from every single thread of the Foxmere House transaction, leaving him standing entirely alone on the stage he had built. The sun rose on the 25th of December without any of the manufactured warmth I had left behind in Matthews. I woke up at 7 in the morning in my Charlotte apartment. The air was perfectly still. I did not turn on the television to watch the holiday parades. I did not play festive music. I walked straight to my home office desk, opened my silver laptop, and brought the screen to life. The time for emotional navigation had officially ended the night before. Now, it was entirely a matter of strict procedure. I opened my email client and began drafting a single, masterfully cold message. I did not write it as a wounded daughter. I wrote it as the Senior Construction Compliance Director of Ashbourne Risk Collective. I addressed it directly to the primary loan officer at the mezzanine lending firm, the lead underwriter at the title company, the managing partner of the seller's legal team, the commercial real estate brokers, and every single address that had ever appeared in the Foxmere House communication threads. The subject line was devoid of any pleasantries. It simply read, "Formal notice of complete withdrawal and non-participation regarding Foxmere House acquisition." The body of the text was even shorter. I typed with deliberate, heavy keystrokes. I stated clearly and unequivocally that effective immediately, I was no longer providing any form of informal review, consultation, or risk assessment for the property purchase. I explicitly forbade the use of my name, my corporate title, or my professional reputation to create any illusion of endorsement or security. I wrote that any forward assumptions made by any party regarding my involvement were entirely without my consent and completely invalid. I read the words twice to ensure there was absolutely no room for interpretation or negotiation. There was no anger in the text. There was no resentment or family drama bleeding into the margins. It was merely a surgical severing of legal liability. I hit send. I did not stop there. In my line of work, sending a notice is only half the battle. Preserving the exact condition of the battlefield is the other. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously downloading every single email thread related to the project. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the delivery receipts and the automated out-of-office replies from the various law firms and banking institutions. I saved the precise timestamps of my sent messages. I even carbon copied the internal compliance officers at my own firm, creating a permanent third-party record of my total disengagement. I wanted the digital footprint to be so massive and undeniable that no attorney could ever claim my withdrawal was merely a private family dispute. I created a heavily encrypted, dedicated folder on my hard drive and filed every piece of documentation away. I organized the data exactly as I would for a corporate client facing a massive, imminent audit. I was building an impenetrable wall of evidence, brick by digital brick, against my own flesh and blood by noon. I closed the laptop. The silence in my apartment felt different now. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a fortified perimeter. Around 2 p.m, the digital fallout reached my phone. It started with a single, sharp vibration on the kitchen island, followed rapidly by a relentless, cascading barrage of notifications. I stood a few feet away, watching the screen light up repeatedly. Noah called first. He called 4 times in rapid succession. When I did not answer, he sent a barrage of hostile text messages. His texts were full of spelling errors and raw entitlement, calling me a traitor and demanding I fix whatever button I had just pushed because I was allegedly jeopardizing his future executive role at the resort. Then came Celeste. Her calls were carefully spaced out, designed to inflict maximum emotional pressure. She left 2 voicemails. I listened to the first one on speakerphone. Her voice was trembling, thick with weaponized tears. She framed my actions as a symptom of my supposed inability to understand loyalty, begging me to just call the lenders back and say it was a misunderstanding so my father would not suffer on a holiday. Finally, Daniel called. He did not call twice. He called exactly once and left a very brief, incredibly dense audio message. His tone was not explosive or frightened. It was deeply patronizing. He stated that my little stunt was a pathetic attempt to ruin the season purely out of a bruised ego. He demanded that I retract the emails by the following morning before I caused any actual, permanent damage to the family legacy. I did not reply to a single one of them. I deleted the voicemails. I put the phone on silent and left it face down on the cold marble counter. I walked into the kitchen, ground some fresh coffee beans, and brewed a strong, dark cup. I walked over to the large windows overlooking the quiet city streets of Plaza Midwood, pulled the heavy curtains completely open, and let the pale winter sunlight flood the room. I sat in my favorite armchair and drank my coffee in total peace. For the very first time in my entire life, the heavy, defining silence did not feel like a punishment or an exile. It felt like something I owned. The panic radiating from Matthews was no longer my problem to solve. The afternoon bled into a quiet, uneventful evening. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, and the streetlights flickered on below. At exactly 9 in the evening, my phone screen illuminated in the dark. It was not a number saved in my contacts, but I instantly recognized the Charlotte area code and the specific prefix used by the prestigious downtown law firms. I picked up the device and accepted the call. I did not say hello. I simply waited. The voice on the other end belonged to Reed Holloway. Reed was the highly compensated attorney who had managed my father's legal messes for nearly 2 decades. He was a man who usually smoothed over rough edges with expensive dinners and confident legal jargon. He charged $800 an hour to make massive problems quietly disappear. Tonight, however, his smooth veneer was entirely gone. His voice sounded remarkably tight, thin, and devoid of its usual arrogant warmth. If Reed Holloway was calling me personally on a major holiday evening, it meant the problem was completely uncontainable. He did not offer any seasonal greetings. He did not ask how I was doing. He cleared his throat and told me that a highly serious legal and financial problem had suddenly erupted regarding the Foxmere House closing documents. He stated that the situation was deteriorating at a significantly faster rate than anyone had anticipated. He began to launch into a complicated, winding explanation about escrow instructions and sudden lender hesitation, clearly trying to manage my reaction before delivering the core issue. I did not let him finish his carefully constructed narrative. I cut him off cleanly. I asked him the only question that actually mattered. I kept my tone perfectly level, devoid of any familial inflection. I asked him directly if, after I had issued my formal, legally binding withdrawal at 8 in the morning, my name and my professional title were still being actively utilized in the subsequent closing documents to reassure the underwriters and the seller. The line went completely dead quiet. I could hear the faint, hollow hum of the cellular connection. I could hear Reed taking a slow, shallow breath. That profound, stretching silence lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, but it was the most communicative pause I had ever experienced. It gave me the exact, devastating answer long before he even attempted to formulate a careful legal response. In that fraction of time, the entire landscape of the conflict violently shifted. The fundamental issue was no longer about a ruined holiday dinner or the deep, enduring emotional trauma inflicted by my father. The game had escalated far beyond personal betrayal. This was now a matter of strict corporate liability, undeniable paper trails, and hard, unforgiving evidence. Daniel had not just been leaning on my reputation. He had been forging it into a weapon to secure millions of dollars, and the detonator was now sitting securely in my hands. Reed Holloway inhaled sharply on the other end of the cellular connection. He immediately adopted that smooth, deliberately paced tone he always reserved for managing highly volatile corporate defectors. He tried to brush past my pointed question, insisting with practiced calm that the entire situation was merely a minor clerical friction. He suggested that we could easily resolve the tension if I simply provided a small, informal clarification to the lenders. He wanted me to send a brief note stating that my sudden departure was due to a scheduling conflict rather than a glaring red flag regarding the integrity of the project. But Reed was clearly exhausted, fighting fires on multiple fronts late into the holiday night, and exhausted attorneys inevitably make critical errors. As he aggressively pitched his solution and rattled off the list of angry equity partners he was currently trying to placate, he casually referenced a secondary investor prospectus and a Phase 2 collateral matrix. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I had never been granted access to a Phase 2 collateral matrix. My strictly limited review had been confined entirely to the initial purchase agreements. He had slipped. I ended the call abruptly, citing a poor connection, and immediately went to work. I did not go to sleep. I opened my contact list. The commercial real estate ecosystem in this state is surprisingly small, and professional favors are the ultimate currency of survival. I called a senior underwriting executive I trusted implicitly at a major title firm downtown. It was incredibly late on a holiday, but she owed me a significant debt for catching a fatal zoning flaw in a massive high-rise development 2 years prior. I asked her to pull up whatever she could see on the holding company my father had created for the mountain property. 20 minutes later, she called me back. The grim silence in her voice before she even spoke told me everything I needed to know. She explained that the file was practically radiating legal heat. The primary underwriters were completely freezing the transaction process because they had discovered two massive, undeniable discrepancies. First, the lien waivers from the primary framing and foundation contractors did not match the corresponding banking payment dates. They were clearly post-dated, strongly suggesting my father was illegally shuffling new loan disbursements to pay off old, entirely unrelated corporate debts. Second, the builder liability insurance certificate, a massive and absolutely non-negotiable requirement for closing a project of this scale, had actually expired 60 days ago. It had been seamlessly bundled into the final closing packet and presented to the lenders as if it were perfectly active and fully funded. The title officer sent me a secure, encrypted link to the flagged documents. I downloaded the massive file to my hard drive and began to read through the pages. The deception was not clumsy or haphazard. It was beautifully, terrifyingly formatted. I quickly located the investor memo Reed had accidentally mentioned. It was a glossy 40-page document specifically circulated to high-net-worth individuals seeking private equity placements. On page 12, right under the bold heading of corporate governance, I saw my own name staring back at me. The document did not state that I was a temporary consultant. The text proudly and explicitly described me as the future compliance principal attached to family operations. The carefully crafted paragraphs heavily implied to any outside reader that I would be officially leaving my current firm to permanently oversee the structural integrity of my father's expanding empire. He had painted a detailed picture of a unified, multi-generational corporate powerhouse, using my sterling, unblemished reputation as the primary load-bearing pillar for his entire house of cards. I felt a cold numbness spreading through my chest, but I kept scrolling. I navigated to the Phase 2 collateral matrix. My eyes scanned the dense lists of leveraged heavy equipment, pledged business checking accounts, and personal guarantees. Near the very bottom of the final page, tucked quietly away in a minor subsection titled Supplementary Land Holdings, I saw an address that made my blood turn entirely to ice. It was a specific parcel of land, exactly 42 acres nestled in the western foothills. It was the land I had inherited directly from my biological mother, Marisol Rivera, when she passed away. It was a quiet, undeveloped piece of earth that had absolutely nothing to do with Rivera Custom Interiors. It was mine, legally, historically, and emotionally. It was the only asset I possessed that remained completely untouched by my father's sprawling ambition. Yet, in this heavily distributed financial document, my father had boldly listed my mother's land as a family fallback asset. He had explicitly presented it to the lending syndicate as a guaranteed safety net, an emergency liquidation option ready to be sold off to appease nervous investors if the resort renovations eventually ran over the projected budget. I had never signed a single piece of paper authorizing this inclusion. I had never even been asked. The profound shock of the moment did not stem from the fact that Daniel needed a financial lifeline. The true, paralyzing horror was the sudden realization of how he fundamentally viewed my existence. He had not merely asked for my help. He had looked at my entire life, my demanding career, my hard-earned professional title, and my deeply personal inheritance, and categorized them all as his own available inventory. To him, my life was nothing more than a convenient warehouse of spare parts he felt entirely entitled to raid whenever his own machinery began to break down. The next morning, the aggressive phone calls from my family resumed, but the underlying tone had dramatically shifted from righteous anger to desperate, cloying manipulation. Celeste called me at 9 o'clock in the morning. She was weeping loudly and wetly into the receiver. She desperately tried to soften the devastating blow of the documents, insisting through her tears that Daniel only exaggerated to make things easier with the aggressive city bankers. She tried to frame his blatant corporate fraud as the harmless, understandable boasting of a traditional middle-aged American man simply trying to provide a grand legacy for his household. She begged me to understand that men in his high-pressure positions simply overpromised in the boardroom and figured out the actual details later. She wanted me to accept financial forgery as a quirky personality trait. Noah called shortly after she hung up. He completely bypassed the emotional tears and went straight for the throat. He called me a cold-blooded traitor. He shouted that if the funding completely collapsed and the core business went under, throwing his own luxurious lifestyle into jeopardy, everyone in our social circle would know exactly who murdered the family legacy on Christmas week. He demanded I call the title company and pretend I had authorized the collateral list. I listened to their predictable, toxic chorus in the quiet of my kitchen, but their words felt incredibly hollow, like meaningless echoes bouncing off a distant canyon wall. I realized exactly what they were doing. They were frantically trying to force me back into the old, comfortable family narrative. In their preferred version of reality, I was always the rigid, unforgiving daughter who was obsessively focused on the rules, while they were simply passionate, loving people who occasionally misspoke or made sloppy administrative errors out of a deep desire to build a family empire. But this time, I did not engage. I did not raise my voice to argue about their emotional motives or defend my own character. A forged legal document does not care about complicated family dynamics or the stress of the holiday season. I looked down at the printed collateral matrix resting on my desk. The truth was stark, undeniable, and completely devoid of sentiment. I simply registered the absolute, unforgiving fact of the matter. My father had not just crossed a professional boundary in a moment of panic. He had actively, deliberately begun to spend the very fabric of my life on paper, trading my secure future for his own temporary survival, long before he ever bothered to ask for my permission. Reed Holloway operated under the classic, outdated assumption that a lone, uncooperative individual could always be quietly crushed by the sheer, suffocating weight of a collective corporate stare. 2 days after the holiday disaster, he coordinated an emergency, mandatory conference call. He designed the digital gathering to be a high-pressure gauntlet. He invited my father, the lead underwriters from the mezzanine lending syndicate, the aggressive managing partner of the seller team, the senior title officer, and me. The strategic intent was incredibly transparent. Reed genuinely believed that if he trapped me in a virtual room filled with powerful, impatient men holding millions of dollars in the balance, my deeply ingrained professional courtesy would override my personal boundaries. He calculated that I would cave to the immense social pressure, offer a soft, face-saving apology, and gently rubber-stamp the delayed closing documents to avoid creating a massive scandal in front of my industry peers. I did not take the call from the soft, vulnerable comfort of my apartment living room. I drove directly into the heart of uptown Charlotte and walked onto the executive floor of Ashbourne Risk Collective. I booked our largest, coldest glass-walled boardroom. The space was a fortress of polished chrome, minimalist leather chairs, and soundproof glass overlooking the sprawling financial district. I dressed in a tailored, razor-sharp charcoal suit, the exact armor I wore when I had to walk into a room and tear a fraudulent contractor to absolute pieces. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, opened my pristine, unmarked legal pad, and dialed into the bridge line exactly 1 minute before the scheduled start time. I was not there as a daughter feeling the sting of family rejection. I was there strictly as a senior construction compliance director defending her sovereign professional territory. The electronic chimes sounded one by one as the various parties joined the encrypted line. The heavy, pressurized silence of high-stakes finance immediately filled the digital space. You could hear the faint rustling of expensive paper, the nervous clearing of throats, and the subtle, shallow breathing of men who knew their quarterly bonuses were suddenly in severe jeopardy. Reed Holloway opened the proceedings. He attempted to set a calm, collaborative tone, utilizing his smoothest, most expensive country club voice. He officially introduced everyone on the line and then immediately handed the floor over to my father to control the narrative. Daniel cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was dripping with a thick, completely manufactured confidence. He sounded exactly like a man pitching a minor cosmetic upgrade to a wealthy homeowner, completely unbothered by the massive structural failures beneath the floorboards. He addressed the silent executives on the line, smoothly classifying the sudden halt in the paperwork as a highly unfortunate, completely harmless communication timing issue. He chuckled, a deep resonant sound designed to project pure masculine control. He casually explained to the bankers and lawyers that I had always possessed an overly cautious nature, a professional habit of getting tangled up in the minor details. He painted a picture of a slight, temporary misunderstanding between a visionary builder and his overly diligent, slightly anxious daughter. He assured the entire room that we were all on the exact same page regarding the ultimate success of the resort venture. He finished his practiced monologue and left a calculated pause, the exact space where I was supposed to quietly agree and surrender my leverage. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch, forcing the tension back onto the other side of the line. The dead air grew incredibly heavy, suffocating the manufactured optimism my father had just tried to pump into the room. The managing partner representing the seller finally broke the silence. He was an older, ruthless attorney who did not care about family dynamics. He only cared about the legal integrity of the escrow account. His voice cut through the static, sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. He did not address my father. He addressed me directly. He asked, deliberately emphasizing every single syllable, if I was currently reviewing any lien releases, structural risk assessments, or reserve-related materials for the Foxmere House acquisition. I leaned closer to the sleek microphone embedded in the center of the boardroom table. I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping away any trace of hesitation, anger, or familial warmth. I answered him without a single wasted breath. I stated clearly that the answer was no. I informed the entire bridge line that I had formally withdrawn my services in writing on Christmas morning at exactly 8:14 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. I stated, with absolute, chilling clarity, that any current reliance on my name, my title, or my professional reputation by any party involved in this transaction was occurring entirely without my legal consent. The atmosphere on the line shifted violently and instantly. The polite, collaborative illusion evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of institutional self-preservation. The lead underwriter for the mezzanine lender, a woman who controlled a massive stream of capital, immediately seized control of the interrogation. Her tone shifted instantly from mild annoyance to sharp, aggressive verification. She bypassed Reed entirely and asked me a direct, incredibly dangerous question. She demanded to know if the primary offering memorandums and the Phase 2 collateral matrices submitted to her committee weeks ago had utilized my corporate title beyond the specific, limited scope I had originally permitted. This was the absolute turning point. This was the exact moment I could have launched into a bitter, emotional tirade. I could have exposed the entire fraudulent timeline, screaming about my mother's land and my father's lies. But a seasoned compliance director knows that over-explaining is a sign of weakness. True, devastating power lies in strict, unyielding minimalism. I did not offer a long, vindictive accusation. I simply stated that I could not, and would not, verify the accuracy or the legality of any statements, projections, or representations made by the holding company after the exact minute of my formal withdrawal. Furthermore, I stated that I absolutely did not authorize anyone to present me as a permanent compliance principal or to suggest that I was providing ongoing, long-term support to the family enterprise. My incredibly brief, sterile statement hit the digital room like a controlled demolition. By refusing to validate the past and legally severing myself from the future, I had effectively pulled the structural linchpin right out of my father's elaborate narrative. Daniel finally snapped. The polished, visionary developer act completely disintegrated, exposing the desperate, cornered man underneath. He forgot about the unmuted microphones. He forgot about the silent, judging presence of the institutional lenders. He lost his temper completely. His voice spiked into a harsh, frantic yell that echoed painfully through the boardroom speakers. He accused me of actively destroying the family over a meaningless, petty argument. He shouted that I was throwing away decades of his hard work just to prove a selfish point about some stupid paperwork. That single, explosive outburst was the fatal blow. It was not my cold withdrawal that killed the room. It was his emotional, reckless confirmation. By screaming about family betrayals and meaningless arguments in response to a strict inquiry about corporate document integrity, my father inadvertently confessed to the entire syndicate. In that one panicked sentence, every single professional on the line instantly understood that this was never a minor procedural delay. They realized they were standing knee-deep in a volatile, highly unstable domestic dispute masquerading as a legitimate commercial real estate transaction. The immediate aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely professional. The seller's attorney cut into my father's rant, his voice dripping with ice, and formally announced that his client was officially suspending the closing process. He stated that due to the sudden, glaring inconsistencies regarding the guarantor structure, the massive sum of earnest money currently sitting in escrow was now formally at risk of being held indefinitely pending a full legal review. The lead underwriter curtly echoed the sentiment, stating her firm was placing an immediate, hard freeze on all approved capital disbursements. The call ended abruptly, a rapid succession of digital clicks as the furious attorneys and terrified bankers scrambled to disconnect and protect their own firms. I sat alone in the quiet, glass-walled boardroom high above the city. I closed my legal pad. I knew exactly what was happening in the room back in Matthews. For the very first time in his entire life, Daniel Rivera was staring at a completely silent speakerphone, entirely surrounded by a massive, catastrophic mess that his booming laugh, his firm handshakes, and his towering, aggressive confidence were no longer nearly enough to fix. The summons arrived less than 48 hours after the disastrous bridge line collapsed. It was not a phone call from my father, but a carefully worded text message from Celeste, suggesting a quiet, civilized dinner on neutral territory to smooth things over like adults. The location was a high-end waterfront steakhouse on the shores of Lake Norman, the kind of establishment where the valet parking alone cost $40 and the private dining rooms were wrapped in dark mahogany and sound-dampening velvet. I arrived exactly at 7 o'clock in the evening. The hostess guided me to a secluded alcove in the back of the restaurant. They were already seated. Daniel, Celeste, and Noah occupied 3 sides of a heavy circular table, nursing expensive cocktails. The atmosphere they projected was aggressively casual, completely disconnected from the financial wreckage smoking just a few miles down the highway. They looked at me with the expectant, slightly patronizing expressions of people waiting for a difficult teenager to finally apologize for throwing a tantrum. Noah was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling the ice in his glass. Celeste offered a tight, fragile smile, patting the empty chair beside her. Daniel sat at the center, resting his forearms on the white linen tablecloth. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater, looking every bit the weary but magnanimous patriarch, ready to forgive his errant child. He initiated the conversation before the waiter even had a chance to pour my sparkling water. He immediately launched into a masterful, deeply practiced revision of recent history. His tone was low, intimate, and dripping with a manufactured vulnerability. He claimed that the harsh words spoken before the holiday were completely blown out of proportion. He stated he had never actually intended to cut me out of the family. He painted himself as a man simply crushed beneath the immense, crushing weight of high-stakes commercial real estate. Stressed about cash flow and vendor deadlines, he looked at me with a perfectly crafted expression of gentle disappointment, suggesting that my only real crime was possessing a terrible sense of timing. He framed my professional boundaries as an unfortunate, stubborn overreaction that had simply caught him on a bad night. Noah eagerly jumped in right on cue to reinforce the narrative. He scoffed, taking a slow sip of his drink, and announced that everyone in the household knew Daniel had a habit of exaggerating when he was backed into a corner. Noah smirked and labeled me a professional drama queen, a person who took every minor infraction and turned it into a federal case just to feel important. They were building a comfortable, familiar bridge, offering me a chance to walk across it and pretend the structural foundations were not completely rotted through. All I had to do was nod, admit I was overly emotional, and quietly fall back into line. I did not argue with their assessment. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity against their coordinated gaslighting. Arguing implies a negotiation, and I was entirely done negotiating my own reality. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. I had not come to the restaurant to share a meal. I pulled out a sleek black manila folder and placed it squarely in the center of the table, pushing aside a silver breadbasket to make room. I opened the cover. I did not speak a single word as I laid out the physical evidence. First, I placed the printed copies of my formal withdrawal emails, highlighting the exact timestamps proving I had severed my professional ties long before the bank froze the funds. Then, I slid the glossy investor prospectus across the linen. The exact page clearly circled where my name and corporate title were weaponized to secure private equity. Finally, I placed the collateral matrix right in front of Celeste. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the subsection, describing the 42 acres of land inherited from my late mother, cleanly categorized as a family fallback asset. The sudden silence in the private dining room was absolute and suffocating. It felt like a ticking explosive had just been placed gently among the crystal wine glasses. I watched Celeste. Her eyes scanned the printed lines. Her tight, polite smile completely dissolved, replaced by a raw, genuine pallor. Celeste was a woman who comfortably turned a blind eye to creative accounting and aggressive business tactics, but she was not inherently evil. She had genuinely believed the narrative that Daniel was just verbally bluffing the bankers. Seeing the actual, physical documents. Seeing that her husband had officially pledged my personal inheritance and my unblemished corporate reputation to aggressive outsiders without a shred of permission, shattered her carefully maintained illusion. She looked up at Daniel, her breath catching in her throat, realizing for the very first time the terrifying depth of his desperation. Daniel stared at the papers. The magnanimous Patriarch Act vanished instantly. He was suddenly trapped in a very small room with undeniable proof of his own predatory behavior. The walls of his carefully constructed reality were closing in rapidly. Cornered and panicking, he scrambled for a justification, desperately trying to reframe the unforgivable as a simple familial assumption. He leaned forward, his voice losing its smooth resonance, breaking into a raw, defensive pitch. He stammered that I was taking the legal phrasing entirely out of context. He insisted that the land was only listed as an absolute last resort, a theoretical cushion to make the underwriters feel secure. And then, in his frantic rush to normalize his actions, he made the fatal, clarifying error. He waved his hand dismissively at the papers and blurted out that he never actually intended to touch my mother's property because he firmly believed he would not need to. He openly admitted, right there in the quiet alcove, that he had internally calculated I would simply use my substantial year-end corporate bonus to quietly bridge the gap on the delayed subcontractor payments if the cash flow completely stalled. He looked at me with a twisted, desperate earnestness and stated that he knew I would just step up and do the right thing when the pressure hit, exactly like I always did. That single, frantic sentence completely paralyzed the room. Noah stopped swirling his drink. Celeste closed her eyes. It was the most brutally honest thing my father had ever said to me. The confession hung in the air, stripping away decades of complex emotional manipulation and toxic family loyalty, leaving behind a truth so painfully clean it practically burned. He did not view me as a daughter to be protected or a person with independent needs. He did not care about my emotional well-being or the ethical boundaries of my profession. He viewed me entirely as a renewable resource. He saw my rigorous career, my high salary, and my impeccable credit score as an emergency liquidity facility that he had absolute sovereign rights to draw upon whenever his own reckless gambling failed. He demanded family loyalty, but what he actually required was blind, unquestioning financial subjugation. I felt a profound, sudden lightness in my chest. The guilt that had haunted me for years was suddenly gone. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly gathered my black leather tote bag and pushed my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floorboards, signaling the absolute end of the engagement. I stood up, looking down at the man who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me into a manageable tool for his own success. I looked him dead in the eyes, keeping my voice perfectly steady and incredibly quiet. I told him that he had never actually asked for my help. I stated that he had simply budgeted my life as if it entirely belonged to him. I turned my back on the table, walked out of the velvet-lined room, and left them sitting in the absolute silence of their own making. The immediate consequence of the Lake Norman dinner was not a dramatic family reconciliation. It was a rapid, cascading sequence of institutional fail-safes snapping shut. Less than 72 hours after I walked out of the steakhouse, the heavy machinery of commercial finance began to grind my father into dust. The seller of the mountain property, acting on the aggressive advice of his legal counsel, issued a formal, binding notice. They officially declared their intention to retain the entire earnest money deposit, a massive sum well over $250,000. They cited a total failure on the part of the buyer to provide verifiable proof of funds necessary to clear the existing vendor arrears. Exactly as my father had quietly promised he could do. The dominoes were finally falling, and they were falling exactly as I had predicted. The title company, terrified of absorbing the liability, sent a sharp demand letter requiring immediate documented clarification on dozens of unreleased subcontractor invoices that were attached to the main property. Simultaneously, the mezzanine lending syndicate officially placed the entire Foxmere House portfolio on an indefinite hold. They issued a brief, terrifying statement declaring the delay was pending a comprehensive internal review. In the corporate world, an internal review is not a pause. It is a death sentence for momentum. The fallout did not remain contained to the mountain resort. It never does. Through the quiet, highly efficient whisper network of the Charlotte risk management community, I learned that the contagion had already reached the core operations of Rivera Custom Interiors, a senior underwriter at a major surety brokerage, the exact firm that provided the essential performance bonds for my father to bid on large commercial jobs, started making discreet but highly targeted inquiries. He began asking uncomfortable questions about my father's older, supposedly settled payable accounts on projects that had been completed 6 months prior. My professional experience told me exactly what this meant. When a surety broker gets nervous, the risk multiplies exponentially. If the industry begins to doubt a general contractor's fundamental payment model, every single active construction contract they currently hold is suddenly subjected to microscopic scrutiny. Suppliers start demanding cash on delivery. Subcontractors threaten to walk off job sites unless they see cleared checks. My father had spent decades spinning plates, using the deposit from the next job to pay the framing crew on the last job. Now, the music had completely stopped, and everyone was demanding their money at the exact same time. Simultaneously, a completely different, highly destructive variable entered the equation. The lender's forensic audit of the holding company inevitably bled into the operational accounts of the primary business, and the auditors discovered my younger brother's reckless financial habits. Noah had not merely been irresponsible. He had been actively treating the corporate expense accounts like a bottomless, unmonitored personal trust fund. The accounting review uncovered a brand new, fully loaded heavy-duty truck, multiple luxury weekend excursions to expensive coastal resorts, and thousands of dollars in high-end consumer electronics. Every single one of these personal indulgences had been clumsily categorized in the general ledger under the vague, insulting heading of brand development. While Daniel was desperately trying to project an image of a wealthy, secure empire to the bankers, his golden son was actively siphoning the remaining liquidity right out of the corporate checking account. Desperate to regain control of a narrative that was rapidly slipping through his fingers, my father resorted to his oldest, most reliable defensive tactic. He attempted to build an emotional fortress. He started calling our extended relatives. He spent countless hours on the phone with my aunts, uncles, and family friends, weeping and painting a tragic picture of a hardworking man viciously betrayed by his own flesh and blood. He claimed I was executing a cold, selfish revenge plot purely out of arrogance, spite, and a deep-seated desire to ruin his holiday happiness. However, his carefully rehearsed emotional theater failed to gain any real traction this time. In the past, the family would have blindly rallied around his tears and condemned my independence. This time, the gossip was instantly diluted by a single, terrifying word that kept surfacing in every hushed phone conversation: documents. No matter how loudly my father cried about family loyalty, the extended relatives were not foolish. They knew that powerful downtown banks do not freeze multi-million-dollar loans over a simple family argument. They freeze them over forged documents. The sheer weight of the paper trail completely crushed his emotional spin. I did not engage in the exhausting phone wars. I did not call my aunts to defend my character or explain the nuances of builder liability insurance. I recognize that fighting an emotional battle with irrational people is a complete waste of energy. Instead, I hired a ruthless, highly independent corporate litigator who specialized in defamation and fraud. I instructed her to draft a highly specific, surgical cease and desist order. It was not a long, emotional letter filled with grievances. It was 3 paragraphs of pure, concentrated legal threat. It strictly forbade Daniel, his company, and his legal representatives from ever using my name, my professional title, or any implied reference to my inherited property in any future financial disclosures, private equity pitches, or loan negotiations. We sent it via certified courier directly to Reed Holloway's downtown office, ensuring there was a permanent, legally binding record of my absolute boundary. While the Rivera household frantically attempted to extinguish the blazing inferno that was rapidly consuming their business empire, I deliberately turned my focus entirely toward my own future. On a quiet, sunlit Tuesday afternoon, I sat in a pristine real estate office in the Plaza Midwood neighborhood. I was completely alone, and I was finalizing the mortgage paperwork for a beautiful, historic townhouse. I read every single clause of the massive contract. I verified the title history. I provided my own legitimate, heavily documented proof of funds. I signed my own name on the dotted line, knowing that every single dollar backing the purchase was earned through my own relentless hard work and professional integrity. Buying that house was a profound, quiet victory. It was the ultimate physical symbol that my future, my sanctuary, and my financial stability were no longer tethered to their chaotic emotional leverage or their fraudulent schemes. I had built my own solid foundation, far away from the rotting wood of my childhood home. The most compelling aspect of this entire collapse was my own lack of physical effort. I did not launch a massive offensive campaign. I did not sabotage his construction sites, call his vendors to spread rumors, or plot a complex scheme of active retaliation. The true power of the situation lay in my complete and total stillness. For decades, I had been the invisible load-bearing pillar holding up the sagging roof of his ambition, constantly fixing his mistakes and catching the heavy consequences before they hit the ground. When I finally decided to step aside, I did not have to push the building over. I simply stopped holding it up. I stood perfectly still, protected by my own rigid boundaries, and watched with a cold, clear mind as a corrupt, unsustainable system naturally and inevitably collapsed entirely under its own immense weight. The digital chime of my cellular phone broke the quiet sanctuary of my new living room exactly 3 days after my lawyer sent the formal cease and desist order to my father. I looked down at the glowing screen resting on the coffee table and saw Reed Holloway calling for the 2nd time that week. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up the device and accepted the connection. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited for him to speak. When he finally opened his mouth, the expensive, polished veneer he usually wore like a custom suit was entirely stripped away. He did not sound like a high-powered corporate attorney expertly managing a wealthy, demanding client. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a rapidly crumbling cliff, watching the ground give way beneath his expensive leather shoes. He told me immediately, his voice completely devoid of its usual persuasive rhythm, that we were no longer dealing with a simple escrow dispute or a minor banking delay over cash reserves. The situation had aggressively metastasized from a frustrating financial hurdle into an active, severe legal crisis. He spoke quickly, his words clipped and heavy with impending disaster. He revealed that a commercial plumbing subcontractor from a completely separate office park project my father had finished nearly 8 months ago had just filed a formal notice of intent to lien. Under normal circumstances, a single unpaid vendor is a headache that can be smoothed over with a quick wire transfer. However, these were not normal circumstances. The fatal issue was not the unpaid debt itself. The catastrophic problem was that my father had explicitly sworn in a binding, notarized affidavit to the mountain resort lenders that all of his previous corporate obligations were fully resolved and strictly accounted for. By signing that legal paper while fully knowing the plumbing company was still owed tens of thousands of dollars, my father had boldly crossed the hard, unforgiving line between aggressive business tactics and actionable financial fraud. It raised the immediate, terrifying legal question of whether he had intentionally and maliciously misrepresented his overall financial health to secure the massive new loan. Before I could fully process the gravity of the plumbing lien, Reed took a shallow breath and delivered the next devastating blow. The aggressive legal team representing the property seller had not been resting on their laurels. They had been digging relentlessly through the discovery files and the preliminary communication logs. During their excavation, they had unearthed an internal side letter that my father had carelessly drafted and sent to a local zoning consultant. In this hidden, highly damaging document, my father had confidently promised that the Phase 1 repair funds would be entirely backed by private equity sources. The problem was that those outside sources were completely imaginary. He had legally pledged capital he simply did not possess and did not control in any capacity, Reed stated, his tone dropping to a grim whisper, that the opposing counsel was now formally preparing to classify the entire transaction under the crushing legal banner of material misrepresentation. The attorney did not attempt to sugarcoat the impending damage or offer false hope. He explained with brutal honesty that if the seller and the massive banking syndicate officially pursued a claim of material misrepresentation, the destruction would absolutely not be contained to the loss of the mountain property. The blast radius would instantly consume the $250,000 in earnest money, but it would not stop there. The legal fallout would travel straight up the corporate ladder and directly strike the core foundation of his primary business. It would trigger a catastrophic, automatic default on every single active performance bond and liability insurance policy his company held. The long-standing, highly respected business reputation my father had spent over 30 years aggressively building would be publicly and permanently eviscerated in civil court. Then came the true, desperate purpose of the evening phone call. Reed was not calling to keep me updated out of the goodness of his heart, nor was he calling to apologize for his client. He was desperately searching for a human shield to absorb the incoming legal fire. He proposed a very specific, heavily engineered solution to mitigate the impending disaster. He asked me to sign a retroactive affidavit. He wanted me to put my legally binding signature on a document explicitly stating that the glossy investor brochures describing my role as a permanent compliance principal were merely informal shorthand. He needed me to officially declare that my father was simply using casual family terminology to impress the bankers, and that no reasonable financial institution should have ever interpreted those words as an actual, binding corporate guarantee. I listened to his desperate, winding pitch. In total, absolute silence. I understood the fundamental shift in their legal strategy instantly. They were no longer trying to bully me into saving the massive real estate deal. The mountain resort dream was already dead, buried under a mountain of forged paper and careless lies. They were terrified. They desperately needed me to actively cover up his past crimes to reduce his immense personal liability. They wanted me to willingly perjure myself, to permanently tarnish my own impeccable professional record, simply to provide my father with a flimsy, fabricated legal alibi to keep him out of a courtroom. I told Reed very calmly that my attorney would immediately reject any such fraudulent document, and I ended the call without waiting for his response. Later that exact same evening, the notification light on my phone pulsed quietly in the dark. I had received a single voicemail. It was from Daniel. When I pressed play, I did not hear the confident visionary who had commanded the dining room table on Christmas Eve. He did not try to sound commanding or authoritative. He did not yell, and he did not launch into a theatrical monologue accusing me of maliciously destroying the family legacy. He sounded hollow, entirely defeated, and incredibly old. He left a rough, completely unpolished message that lacked any of his usual manipulative charm. He confessed, his voice devoid of any performance, that he had honestly thought I would eventually just calm down like I always did. He openly admitted that he had gambled his entire professional existence on the fundamental assumption that I would eventually step in, swallow my pride, fix the broken paperwork, and quietly clean up his massive mess before anyone outside the family noticed. I sat alone in the quiet shadows of my living room and played the short audio message 3 consecutive times. I listened to the heavy exhaustion in his breathing and the raw entitlement in his words. That single, pathetic sentence killed the very last ounce of lingering guilt I held in my chest. For my entire life, my family had aggressively labeled my quiet utility as love. They had actively convinced me that being relentlessly useful, solving their problems, and absorbing their stress was the only valid way to belong to the household. But hearing his raw, defeated voice stripping away the elaborate illusion, the absolute truth was undeniable. It was never about familial love. It was never about protecting a daughter. It was only ever about an endless, parasitic expectation. He viewed my loyalty and my professional competence as a permanent, unpaid janitorial service specifically designed to sweep up the shattered pieces of his own reckless ego. The next morning, I poured a cup of black coffee and called my own legal counsel. I instructed her to send one final, highly restricted communication to Reed Holloway. I agreed to attend one last formal meeting, scheduled to take place during the first week of January, immediately following the New Year holiday. However, the terms of my attendance were absolute and non-negotiable. I would not arrive alone. My attorney would be sitting directly beside me every single second. I made it explicitly clear in the communication that I was not walking into that boardroom to negotiate a friendly settlement, to sign a retroactive pardon, or to magically save my father from the severe legal consequences of his own documented fraud. I was attending strictly to enter my own pristine timeline into the official legal record. I was going exactly to cleanly, surgically, and permanently separate my professional existence from his sinking ship, and I would not lift a single finger to stop him from drowning in the waters he had chosen to navigate. The first week of January arrived with a bitter, biting wind that swept aggressively through the towering concrete canyons of downtown Charlotte. I walked into the lobby of a premium alternative dispute resolution firm, my legal counsel walking precisely 1/2 step beside me. We rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the 40th floor. The mediation suite we entered was a masterclass in psychological intimidation and sterile corporate warfare. It was a vast expanse of frosted glass, brushed steel accents, and pale gray carpeting so thick it completely absorbed the sound of our footsteps. The air was heavily filtered and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive citrus cleaning solvents. This was absolutely not a place where people gathered to mend broken relationships or heal emotional wounds. It was a perfectly sanitized, rigidly temperature-controlled environment specifically designed for high-net-worth individuals to legally dismantle each other without making a public spectacle. It was the exact kind of room where someone was about to lose a staggering amount of money, and the suffocating tension was already clinging to the walls. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany conference table. I had mentally prepared myself over the holiday weekend to face the expected cast of characters. I fully anticipated seeing my father, his increasingly desperate attorney Reed Holloway, the aggressive managing partner representing the property seller, and the lead underwriter from the mezzanine lending syndicate. However, as my eyes methodically scanned the heavy leather executive chairs around the room, I realized with a sudden, cold clarity that the crisis had completely breached the containment walls of the mountain resort deal. Sitting rigidly across from me was Warren Pike. Warren was a pragmatic, quietly ruthless businessman who held a 30% minority equity stake in Rivera Custom Interiors. He had been my father's trusted operational anchor and financial stabilizer for over 2 decades. Sitting immediately to Warren's right was a man I did not personally recognize, but whose corporate lapel pin identified him as a senior claims adjuster for the commercial surety provider. Their unexpected presence in this room was a blaring, unmistakable siren. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof that the financial infection had definitively spread from a single fraudulent real estate transaction and was now eating directly into the vital organs of the primary construction enterprise. Despite the terrifying, hostile audience watching his every move, my father attempted to execute one final, desperate theatrical performance. He leaned forward heavily, resting his forearms on the polished wood table. He looked directly at me, completely ignoring the battery of highly paid lawyers and furious bankers surrounding him, and deployed his most practiced, heartbroken patriarch routine. His dark eyes were wide and filled with a manufactured, sorrowful gravity. He spoke in a low, trembling register, practically begging me to remember our shared history. He stated softly that if I would just say one single sentence, if I would just look around the room and state out loud that there had been a simple, unfortunate misunderstanding regarding my corporate role, every single family represented at that table could move forward without suffering catastrophic losses. He looked at me with an expression of pure, wounded innocence, aggressively trying to package his demand for perjury as a noble act of familial grace and forgiveness. While my father played the emotional melody to distract the audience, Reed Holloway attempted to quietly slip the legal poison into my drink. The attorney reached into his leather briefcase and slid a single sheet of heavy bond paper across the table. Stopping it exactly 1 inch from my fingertips, he described the document smoothly as a harmless draft statement, calling it a minor procedural clarification designed solely to satisfy the anxious underwriters and unlock the frozen escrow accounts. I did not pick up the silver pen resting beside my notepad. I read the text perfectly well without ever touching the paper. Beneath the dense, polite legal jargon, the language was incredibly insidious and highly toxic. It contained carefully structured clauses and subtle timeline shifts that would legally allow any reviewing third party to interpret that my professional support for the project had extended far past my actual withdrawal date. It was a masterfully written trap designed to retroactively sanitize my father's corporate fraud and leave me holding the legal liability if the mountain resort project eventually collapsed under federal scrutiny. I looked up from the paper. I did not raise my voice, and I did not look at my father to witness his reaction. I addressed the certified court reporter sitting silently in the corner of the room, her fingers hovering expertly over her stenography machine. I instructed her to formally open the official record. With my attorney nodding slightly in silent approval beside me, I clearly and methodically recited my pristine, heavily documented timeline into the official transcript. I stated the exact day in the early autumn when I had agreed to a strictly limited, informal review of the initial purchase agreements. I stated the exact day and the exact hour on the morning of the 25th of December when I had transmitted my formal written withdrawal to every single party involved in the transaction. I closed my brief statement by declaring absolutely that from that specific minute onward, any reliance on my professional credentials, my corporate name, or my personal assets was entirely unauthorized, entirely fabricated, and legally void. I placed my index finger on the edge of the drafted statement and pushed it slowly back across the table, leaving it resting exactly halfway between Reed and myself. The rejection hung in the sterile, heavily conditioned air, heavy and absolute. That was the precise moment the internal alliance on the other side of the table completely shattered. Warren Pike, the man who had silently and faithfully built the construction business alongside my father for 20 years, finally broke his stoic silence. He turned his heavy leather chair slightly, physically closing his shoulders off from Daniel. Warren did not care about the emotional nuances of a family dispute. He cared entirely about the survival of his retirement portfolio and his own legal exposure. He began asking my father the brutal, direct questions that Celeste and Noah had always been too terrified to voice aloud at the dinner table. He asked Daniel, his tone completely devoid of any former camaraderie or respect, If he had ever actually received my explicit written consent to feature my corporate title so prominently in the private investor deck. Before Daniel could formulate a convincing lie, Warren struck again, his voice rising in anger. He demanded to know if Daniel had ever been granted any legal permission whatsoever to pledge the 42 acres of my inherited land as a secondary collateral asset to secure the massive bridge loans. The confident, booming visionary vanished completely, evaporating under the intense heat of the interrogation. My father began to sweat visibly. He tugged nervously at the collar of his expensive custom dress shirt. He attempted to answer Warren with his usual slippery charm, weaving long, convoluted sentences about implicit family understandings, aggressive marketing strategies, and the fluid nature of commercial negotiations. But Warren was not a gullible client admiring a kitchen remodel. He pressed relentlessly harder, demanding simple, binary answers. Daniel began to stutter. He actively contradicted his own previous statements, claiming in one frantic breath that the documents were just early draft proposals, and in the next desperate breath, insisting that the aggressive city bankers had unfairly pressured him into inflating the security matrix against his will. I sat perfectly still and watched the entire room simultaneously realize the horrifying truth. The atmosphere shifted violently and irreversibly. It transitioned from a collaborative effort to salvage a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction to a grim, predatory assessment of legal liability. The lender and the seller stopped looking at my father as a troubled business partner and began looking at him exclusively as the prime target for a massive, company-destroying civil lawsuit. The surety adjuster sitting next to Warren began typing frantically on his digital tablet, undoubtedly preparing the necessary paperwork to immediately freeze the bonding capacity of the entire Rivera Custom Interiors firm. They were no longer trying to figure out how to creatively fix the broken deal. They were actively calculating exactly who was going to bear the crushing financial consequences, and every single eye in the room was locked dead onto my father. Sensing the absolute loss of control, the managing partner for the seller abruptly called for a temporary recess to consult privately with his angry clients. The executives quickly gathered their briefcases and emptied the room, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. The morning mediation had yielded absolutely no formal conclusion, but a signed ruling was no longer necessary to understand the outcome. Anyone with a shred of professional instinct could feel the massive structural failure occurring in real time. The elaborate, towering fortress of lies my father had built over several decades was currently suspended in midair, completely unsupported by reality. It was a breathtaking, terrifying moment of pure tension. Everything was perfectly aligned, locked in a stagnant, highly pressurized equilibrium, just waiting in the quiet dark for one final piece of paper to surface, or one final, fatal mistake to be made, before the entire system collapsed completely into dust. The abrupt suspension of the morning mediation was not a ceasefire. It was the frantic drawing of battle lines. Less than an hour after the glass doors of the suite swung shut, the absolute full weight of institutional panic descended upon my father. The mezzanine lending syndicate and Warren Pike simultaneously issued a merciless, unified demand. They bypassed Reed Holloway entirely and sent a formal legal ultimatum directly to the corporate servers of Rivera Custom Interiors. They required the immediate, unedited submission of the original internal email chains, every single draft version of the private investor prospectus, and the raw, unpolished backup data supposedly proving my father possessed the required source of funds. They set a hard, non-negotiable deadline of 5 o'clock that exact same afternoon. The sheer volume of the requested data triggered a blind, chaotic panic in the opposition camp. I sat quietly in my attorney's office, watching the digital readouts on her monitor, knowing exactly what was happening across town. They were scrambling to redact, sanitize, and legally obscure the depths of the fraud before the deadline struck. But speed and deception are incredibly dangerous bedfellows. In his absolute haste to pacify the furious bankers and satisfy Warren's aggressive demands, Reed Holloway made the ultimate, unrecoverable administrative error. At precisely 3:45 in the afternoon, Reed sent a massive encrypted file to the entire distribution list. He intended to send the carefully scrubbed, legally neutralized version of the investor deck. Instead, either through sheer exhaustion, crippling pressure, or simple technological incompetence, he attached the raw, unredacted master file. It was a spectacular digital self-immolation. My attorney and I opened the attachment the second it hit our inbox. The document was a breathtaking monument to my father's absolute audacity. There, in high resolution, undeleted text, was the unvarnished truth I had suspected all along. The unredacted slides explicitly detailed a comprehensive multi-year strategy where I was listed as the permanent oversight director for the entire commercial hospitality division. Worse, a separate financial modeling page explicitly calculated my projected year-end corporate bonuses for the next 3 years, brazenly categorizing my personal income as a guaranteed secondary liquidity stream for his subcontractor payroll. The final, most damning slide was a dedicated map of my mother's 42 acres, complete with preliminary zoning notes, explicitly labeled as the ultimate equity buffer to secure the second phase of the resort construction. 10 minutes later, a frantic, automated message flashed across the email server. Reed Holloway was desperately attempting a digital recall of the message. He sent 3 consecutive frantic emails claiming the previous attachment was an outdated, irrelevant draft sent in error, but the internet does not offer a rewind button for corporate perjury. It was entirely too late. Warren Pike, the primary underwriters, and the seller's legal team had already downloaded the file. They had seen the absolute, undeniable proof with their own eyes. I did not have to utter a single word of accusation. I did not have to convince a judge or plead my case to a skeptical audience. My father's own highly paid legal counsel had just hand-delivered the murder weapon directly to the jury. My attorney executed our final maneuver with brutal, surgical precision. We did not submit a lengthy, emotional manifesto. We did not express outrage or demand an apology. We submitted exactly 2 pieces of paper to the entire group. The first was the original, time-stamped email chain proving my absolute withdrawal on Christmas morning. The second was a sworn, notarized declaration strictly defining the incredibly narrow temporary scope of my initial consultation, firmly establishing that I had never authorized a single word of the unredacted master file. There was absolutely no added commentary. There was no emotional closure. There was no mercy. The sheer, sterile minimalism of our response was the final nail in the coffin, completely destroying any remaining path of retreat for Daniel Rivera. The collapse of his empire was not a slow, agonizing decline. It was a rapid, vertical drop. By the following Tuesday, the seller officially and permanently terminated the Foxmere House purchase agreement, citing a blatant, documented breach of contract regarding financial misrepresentation. They legally seized the entire earnest money deposit, absorbing hundreds of thousands of dollars without a single drop of remorse. The mezzanine lending syndicate formally withdrew their entire funding package, blacklisting Rivera Custom Interiors from any future commercial borrowing. The fatal blow, however, came from the surety bond provider. After reviewing the unredacted files, they instantly suspended the company's bonding capacity, pending a deep, forensic internal review, effectively rendering the business legally incapable of bidding on or starting any new commercial construction projects. Warren Pike acted with the ruthless, necessary instinct of a man watching his life's work catch fire, to save the remaining, viable organs of the enterprise from total liquidation. He executed a hostile internal takeover. He leveraged his minority equity stake and the active threat of a massive fraud lawsuit to force Daniel to completely step down from all daily operational duties. My father was stripped of his corner office, his corporate authority, and his booming visionary status. To plug the massive liquidity holes and appease the furious surety underwriters, Warren forced a rushed, humiliating sale of the heavy equipment division at a fraction of its actual market value. During Warren's aggressive forensic sweep of the internal accounting ledgers, the full sickening extent of Noah's financial parasitism was laid completely bare. The corporate credit card statements, the hidden luxury truck payments, and the fraudulent brand development expenses were dragged out into the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. Noah lost his golden boy immunity instantly. Within 48 hours, he was formally terminated from the company, stripped of his corporate vehicle, and left entirely to his own devices, completely incapable of sustaining the lavish lifestyle he had stolen. Even Celeste could no longer maintain the fragile, polite illusion of her marriage. For years, she had comfortably accepted the glossy, confident narrative Daniel had sold her, willfully ignoring the shadows. But looking at the cold, hard numbers, seeing the raw, unredacted proof that her husband had planned to cannibalize his own daughter's inheritance to fund a reckless gamble, the absolute reality finally broke through her denial. She abruptly ceased playing the noble family peacemaker. She quietly packed her bags and moved into a rented condominium across town, completely withdrawing from his defensive perimeter. She did not leave out of some newfound sense of moral superiority. She left because the mathematics of his failure were entirely undeniable, and she refused to go down with the sinking ship. As the ashes of the Rivera family legacy settled over the frozen January landscape, I stood in the quiet, sunlit kitchen of my new home in Plaza Midwood. I finalized the transfer of my mother's land into a heavily fortified, irrevocable trust, ensuring that no one could ever use her memory as collateral again. I poured a glass of cold water and looked out over the city skyline. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no regret. The defining, chilling truth of the entire ordeal was remarkably simple. I did not destroy my father. I did not ruin his business or burn his reputation to the ground. I merely stopped allowing him to use my name, my career, and my life as an infinite, consequence-free credit line. When the artificial support vanished, gravity simply did the rest. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.